Alright, so welcome back to Idaho Art Classes and Kevin McCain Studios. So today we're going to talk a little bit about drawing rocks. And you might say, well, if we're drawing rocks, what's the deal with these shapes? So we have the cube here and the pyramid. And this happens to be the five-sided pyramid, so it has 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then it has the bottom is 5. And that gives you the little square on the bottom. So whenever we're dealing with a pyramid, or if we're drawing the cube has 6 sides, and like we said, this has 5 sides. But we have to deal with definite planes, right? We have a front plane, we have a back plane, we have a right side, we have a left side. So we're having to deal with planes and faces. Using face as another term for the word plane. But yeah, whenever we're dealing with these sorts of shapes, or these three-dimensional solids, as some people would say, we're having to deal with planes. Again, we have a right plane, a right plane, a left plane, a back left plane, a back right plane, a top and a bottom. We have all these planes. Well, whenever we draw something, like let's say we had an apple, okay? So let's say I was drawing an apple or something. We could also take this apple and we can translate this apple into planes. So I could go ahead and say, well, let's see, on the top of this apple we have, we could go ahead and divide this into, some planes here. And I guess we could make this, something like, and I guess maybe we'll just sit that here, since that's kind of what I'm drawing. And we would have, again, we'd have this is going to look like some sort of one of these old puzzles from the 80s or something, back in the day. Some of these retro sorts of things. But we could go ahead and take this round object and we could turn this object into planes. So we're going to simplify it into, again, these different planes that we're dealing with this apple. And by doing this, we can then start to think of how the object would then be shaded and have value on it, or what have you. So again, we go ahead and clarify that. Whatever, we could go ahead and turn this into, again, a multi-planed object. So and that's by doing this, we can start thinking of the way this object turns. And I've used quite a few planes here. We could simplify this, and we could also make it more complex. We could add more planes, we could subtract more planes. But the idea is that when we're doing this, we can start to think, well, this plane is going up, and so if we have a light source here, this is going to catch more light than this, which is straight towards us for the most part, and this then starts to tuck under. Well, now we're thinking about how light crawls around, or how light moves around a three-dimensional surface. And of course that's very important if we're going to give this thing the feeling of solidity and give it a three-dimensional quality. Again, this would be coming across the top straight here. This would then come down at an angle. This is a little bit better than the other one, so it comes straight here, down at an angle like that. That would then straighten out here, and then this would, and you could start to think of this like a little ant or something crawling you know, around and across these different planes. So this would come here, and this would come here, and this would come here. You know, again, if they went this way, you know, and if I had a light source, this would have lighter than this, and this would be, you know, perhaps a little darker than this, depending on the reflected light. And so, again, we could start to put value on these things and start to create the illusion of form by using planes. Now, I could also, again, simplify this. Let's say I was drawing, you know, a little pear. And again, if I'm drawing the pear for the top of this pear, we could then turn this pear up top into a truncated or a modified cone. In other words, the cone has had its top chopped off across here, it's flat. And we could go ahead and we might have, this looks a little short, so maybe we extend it. But the idea is that, again, we have a front plane, we have a right plane. You know, if we thought about this as an ant walking across here, we have a left plane, a right plane, and a front plane. And then if we did the sphere, again, we could go ahead and break this sphere down into a top and then a front, like so. And I'm just going to put this aside. And we could go ahead and continue to then break the sphere part down, or that's sphere-like, and we could go ahead and create, again, something that has very definite planes, so that, again, we're dealing with three-dimensional objects, we're dealing with perspective, we're dealing with all this good stuff. Well, that got a little too many lines there, but again, this would come down, this would then break over to here, this would then come up a little bit, that would then break to there. But anyway, so we'd have, again, this idea of taking something that's round and breaking it and simplifying it down into planes. Okay, now when I started this, let's go ahead and actually make these connect, shall we? Let's act like we know what we're doing here. But clean that up a little bit. But anyway, so we could go ahead, and again, we've taken this pair, and we've then simplified it into something with planes. Almost looks like a one of those old grenades from World War II or something. Maybe that's why I guess they called it more of a pineapple, but from what I've heard referred to as. But anyways, we could go ahead and, again, turn it, simplified into planes. Well, the reason we're talking about planes is because whenever we draw something like rock or stone or something of that nature, we're going to be dealing with planes. Now, this is a little bit more of a rounded rock, but this rock still has very definite planes. If I, and it also, if it's from outside, it's might have some little dirt on it. So, as far as that goes, or we might have, this rock. Again, whenever we have rocks, we have to deal with the planes of this object. And so, some of these, now these guys are pretty round or round-esque, but I think if we looked at this, we could maybe go ahead and say, hey, this is sort of has two sides. It is a little rounded as far as that goes. So this is a little rounded up top. It's kind of like a rounded triangle, right? As far as that goes. So we have the rounded triangle. Now, if I get too round on this, it may stop looking like a rock and start looking like a piece of bread. So even though I have angles, a lot of times that might be slightly rounded, sometimes we'll bring more of the, that curve is actually made up of straight edges. It'll make it feel more like it has planes. By doing that, you'll give something that's like a rock will feel more like a rock, and a little less like, fresh baked bread. So, but the idea is that usually when we start with rocks, we usually get too much into all the different complexities of this rock. Instead of just saying, look, I might have, I don't know, maybe I have a front side here, like so, and then I have this side over here, and then I would have this side over here, something like that. So this is a simplification of these planes. This would be essentially the side plane of the rock, and this would be, of course, the top plane of the rock. Now we don't have the little divots and all that sort of stuff. We start off simple, and then we build more complex. So we don't want to start doing every little divot, every little dimple before we even have, the basic idea of this rock recorded. So we at least want to see the basic plane of this rock. And then once we've got that basic idea of it, well, then we can say, yeah, well, this comes up here, and this kicks back a little bit like so, and then this comes out a little bit like so, and then this, whatever, maybe it dips down a little bit, and it dips back up. You could go ahead and get more complex with this rock, but again, we start thinking of more planes of this rock, but it's still, again, it's a multi-planed object. So this is a flat plane as this kicks back, and this plane comes forward, and that's a plane in front. So that gives you this where this kicks back here, and it comes back, and then it kicks out like there. And so again, we want to be thinking of the basic planes of this object. We don't want to be thinking of, if we think too much about every little nuance, we're going to get lost, and it will feel less like a rock. We could still go, okay, yeah, well, this comes up a little bit like so, and then it kind of comes down a little bit like so, and then maybe even dishes a little bit and comes up. You can go ahead and start to, and this would be rounded, so this comes down and that comes up. You can start to make this wedge shape much more, interesting, like the rock, by bringing this edge down and these, and getting more of that variation. But it's still about planes. We need to be able to see the top side. We need to be able to see, the left side, the right side, the front side, and break that down. We also have, again, another little rock over here. And again, we could take this rock. This really looks like a piece of bread. But again, if I'm drawing this rock about like so, we're going to have, it almost looks like a potato, as far as that goes. And that's the other thing. Sometimes rocks can start to look a little bit like, these rounded ones can start to look like bread, like a loaf of bread, or more like a potato or something. And you got to watch out for that as well, that, we don't have. But if I go ahead and take this, I need this to have, again, a definite, right side. Even though this is actually a little more rounded. So we've got to, again, make sure that we have, there's usually a little bit more of the irregular sort of things going on with a rock. And so we want to look for some of that irregularity. We want to look for that. Some people will talk about the randomness of nature. That's what we're really talking about, is that nature is random. And we still want to be able to have, again, the left side, again, that straight line, a little boring. So we go, okay, that was the basic idea. and then we're going to come over here and look at what the actual thing is doing with this rock as it comes up. And then, oh, you know, again, if we get it too round, it'll start to look again like it's a piece of bread. So we want to make sure we've got something here that's a little less, you know, don't want it to start to look like a symmetrical loaf of bread. So we're going to look for some of the variations in that rock. But we still basically want a top side, we want a right side, and we want a left side. This actually comes over to there. But, so this would be the left side, that would be the right side. So we want to be thinking again about the planes of this object to help us to get something to feel like a rock. Now this is just the basic idea. This is not a great rock. This is not supposed to impress you. But this is the idea that we have to have in order for us to have anything. We have to have the planes of this object. Otherwise it's going to look, you know, it's not going to look like a rock. And as we got into it, you might say, well, this is a plane that comes down a little bit. This is a plane that, you know, comes up and maybe it breaks and comes down here. And then this is a plane that comes down. You know what I mean? You can start fracturing that up, but you need at least these basic planes of a right, a left, and a top. Sometimes there'll be a front. And I guess we could say, well, maybe that's the front. But the idea is that we need at least those three planes. Okay? We're going to go ahead and come back, and we're actually going to draw an actual drawing of a rock. Actually, it's a bunch of rocks. It's like the side of a river or something like that. And so we're going to take these ideas of looking for planes as we then break up the you know, this drawing of into the shapes that look like individual stones and groupings of stones and so forth and so on. All right, so we're going to come back and do that. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit more about rocks. Okay, so we talked a little bit about, you know, planes and dealing with rocks and trying to break things down to planes. We talked about breaking the pear down into planes and or the apple. We're just going to talk real quick about some other things to understand about rocks. If rocks become too round, there's a term called organic. And that means that curves imply a certain sort of life. And so these are, and you can say, well, yeah, we see round-esque rocks in nature, but really they're going to be more like this. So these are much more round, and because of that, they look more like loaves of bread or something like that. You know, this looks like an egg shoved into the ground. Rocks will have flatter edges, so even though these are rounded planes, they have straighter, rounded sections. They will look more rock-like. Straight lines imply what's called inorganic shapes, or some people would just call them dead shapes. We're not talking about chemistry here. We're talking about things that look alive versus things that don't look alive. And in drawing, you'll hear it referred to sometimes as organic shapes versus inorganic shapes, meaning things that are dead or things that are never were alive, like rocks. So again, if we bring in, like, if this is basically this redesigned to look more rock-like. So again, we have definite sections, even though they're slightly rounded, of different planes, and because it has a little bit more of that randomness of nature, and that it has these straight, sort of these rounded planes, definite sections, it's going to feel more like a rock. This will not feel like a rock. This will feel more like a rock. So sometimes, it's very rare that you'll ever get anything in nature that is perfectly rounded like this. It is an absolute anomaly. Now, that doesn't mean it's impossible, but it means that it's an anomaly. With artists, we do what is common most times because of the fact that we can identify something that's universal. And so with the rocks, it's universal that, again, they don't have as rounded edges. So this is, this one reimagined to feel more rock-like, again, where we can start to see definite planes of that rock. So think about that whenever you're drawing rocks and ask yourself, is it getting too much of a unbroken, and you can say, well, these are kind of rounded, and they are, but understand that this seems like an unbroken rounding edge, whereas this, we can break this up into three different sections. And so that's what I mean. These are slightly cupped and they're slightly rounded. These are the kind of rocks you'd see kind of in, around, streams and rivers and stuff like that, where they've tumbled around and the water has rounded them off. But even so, they are not perfectly round. They have some randomness, some irregularity, some planar structures. And so that's something we want to think about. And so this is another example of this, because sometimes, or many times I should say, as artists, and especially if you're doing a whole drawing of rocks in this, in this riverbed or something like that, you're going to have to simplify a lot. And again, sometimes in that simplification, we'll make rocks like this. So this, again, looks almost, exactly like a loaf of bread. I mean, it looks like it came right out of the oven of Grandma's kitchen. And we don't want that. So all these here are basically taking this shape and redesigning it. The one that takes the least amount of liberties is probably this one down here. But again, this is now angling this way. It has 1, 2, 3 sections. This is also angling this way, whereas this is slightly rounded, but for the most part these are straighter down. So this has, this is worn here, and then this cups under here. The top is not, just this rounded mound. It comes up a little bit, it comes over a little bit, it comes up a little bit, it comes over a little bit, it comes down. There's more. And if we took this section here, this section here to here is longer than this section from here to here. So so it's design, and by design we're looking for things that are different, contrast. We don't want the sameness. So, if I have, a round shape like this, that's never going to be as interesting as a shape that has a little bit more variation to it. Oh, that's probably so light you can't even see it. So again, I forgot I've got this graphite pencil in my hand. So if I've got a rounded shape like that, that will never be as interesting as a shape where we go ahead and have a little bit more, change to it. Now these would still be too organic, but the idea is that that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to create interest by varying the surface, and we try to make areas that are bigger. So this is the larger hump that comes up a little bit higher, and this one's a little softer. It's a little bit more interesting than if I had, say, something like, now I made it into an M, maybe we could even dish that out, but the idea is, or if we wanted to make it really bad, we'd just have something that looks like that. And again, these are about, let's go ahead and get that there. This distance to here is about the same as that distance to there, so they're the same, they're sameness. And as a designer, you'd rather have something that's not the same. So if we took this one and we divide this in half, in terms of where it starts to curve out for the next curve, and we took that distance versus this distance, there's more interest because there's more contrast. Smaller against larger, and you get it. And so when we start designing, we start thinking about this again. This section here is shorter than that section there. This is almost the same, in which case as a designer I'd be like, I might push it. I might make this one come out over here a little bit more to shorten this and lengthen that. But these are all taking this shape and trying to redesign it in ways that are more interesting. When we have rocks, many times, especially lots of rocks, we need to try to design them in a way that's much more interesting. But even this one that's not quite as extreme as some of these others, this is going to look more rock-like than this. And this is still a rounded rock. This is not a jagged rock by any stretch of the imagination. So we're going to start out by drawing a rock here. And I'm going to have an image that's going to be on the, that you can see what I was drawing from. And I'll try to put the link up to the image as well. But if I was going ahead and drawing this again, and I'm going to think about planes, and I'm going to think about it in just terms of its most simple forms, in terms of this rock that I'm drawing. And I guess this is still kind of light, so we'll go ahead and darken this a little bit more. But we're going to end up with something that's going to look about like, and again, this is a rounded rock. This is right out of a riverbed. And again, we're just trying to get the basic angles. Again, we're thinking of planes. So I could have simplified this into fewer sections, but this would be the beginning, you know, of drawing the basic planes of this rock. And then the next thing we would do is we'd try to go ahead, or not try, but we would go ahead and start to put on here the shadow shapes. And so if I did that, I would end up with something this is the shadow, this is the light. Something about, whoops, that needs to come up a little bit and over a little bit. Again, and I'm breaking this down into simple planes with this shadow shape. So something about like that. So again, this would be very simply the shadow section of the rock. Whenever we draw, we want to try to use our techniques of looking for value, squinting your eye, taking your eyes out of focus. If you have to, you can put your hand over your eye to block all the ambient light. In fact, you can curl your hand up like you're going to look through it, like a little, you know, like a little, there we go, like a little telescope or something. And you put this on against your eye, and that way, just like the hood of a camera, it blocks the ambient light. And again, you can see the value much better. And again, if you're still having problems with seeing it, another way of doing it, and it's something that you don't want to do every time you ever do this. You want to do it just enough to start to train your eye. But the last thing you would do, because again, you don't want it to become a crutch, where you're like, I can't do a drawing if I don't have my smartphone. What you can do is you can take a picture with your phone, go into the edit mode, find the color settings of that picture. I can't think of any phone that doesn't allow you to edit that sort of stuff, and go into saturation. And it's the saturation of the color, and you pull the saturation down to 0, and it makes it a black and white photograph. And all of a sudden you can see the value. So again, we're going to try to look for those shadow shapes. The more you look, the more you really start to take to look at stuff, the better you're going to be at that. And of course, we would also have a cast shadow coming off of here. Something about like this, just really simple for that cast shadow. And we have the basics of drawing the image. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and come back after a quick break, and we're going to get this set up, and we're actually going to do this drawing of this basic stone or rock, and we're going to be using some different tools and some graphite and some other fun stuff. All right, we'll be right back. All right, so welcome back. So these are the materials we're going to be using for our drawing. And I'm going to be using a kneaded eraser. We're going to be using a plastic eraser. It doesn't have to be a Prismacolor. You want it to be a plastic or latex eraser. We're going to be using this, again, this is kind of like a mechanical pencil, but it's got a plastic eraser in the end. Same thing with this, except it's a little bigger. So these will be the erasers I'm going to use. I'm going to use a little bit of tissue. So that's what we're going to have for that stuff. Let's move this aside, get this out of the way. We're going to be using graphite pencils, basically a 4H, a 2H, an HB, a 2B, and a 4B. I grabbed a fistful of pencils, and so instead of the 2B and 4B, I've got a 3B and a 6B. Again, 2B, 4B would do just as well. I just didn't have the time to ramble through all the supplies to find the exact pencil. If you got a 3B and a 6B, you can use it, but a 2B and a 4B is going to give you about the same. We're going to be using them, you're going to get the same range of value. We've also got some, this is charcoal, this is vine charcoal. You could use willow charcoal as well, but we're going to use vine. This will help me in the lighter areas. We're going to put in some tone with the charcoal, and then we're going to put the charcoal away, and we're going to do the rest with graphite. It just saves us a whole lot of time, giving us a base value for when we draw. That base value is really nice. Never put charcoal over graphite. Ever, 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 ever. I guess I've seen some people where they're using H pencils and then they do a charcoal drawing using the H pencils as their lights. I normally try to keep everything either charcoal or graphite. The only time I don't is this technique where we're gonna knock out some of the white of the paper with very, very light charcoal. Then we're gonna put the charcoal away. We're not gonna use it anymore, and we're gonna go into just graphite. These are not charcoal sticks. These are actually graphite sticks. And the reason we have these is, of course, we have more surface area. So I can cover more area much more quickly than with this little pencil here. You know, mostly wood with very little graphite. This has a lot more, you know, graphite. So that's what we're going to be using for this drawing. Let's go ahead and get started. Now I'm going to have a picture of the image and probably a link to the image if you want to, you know, so choose, where you can go ahead and click on that and you know, do this with us. So I went ahead and before it showed me doing a quick sketch of this rock. This is, again, I've gone ahead and redrawn it very lightly here, and I went ahead and put in the shadow shape. So essentially what I've got here is what we had before. I've gone ahead and done this. Okay, and I've put it on here. So that's what we're going to use this. Now you could have done some basic measuring for this. The rock that I'm drawing, and you know, I went ahead and did this without, but the rock I'm drawing here is about a 2-to-1 rectangle is what it fits inside. So we've got that drawn out. And we're just going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to grab a little bit of this charcoal and we're just going to go ahead and we're going to get started on this. So I'm going to grab one more tool. Alright, so I went ahead and we grabbed this. Now this is just a brush. You could use any sort of goat hair brush. This is just one. This is a brush that my wife was going to throw away, so I was like, give me that! Because it's really nice and soft. But any sort of 2-inch goat hair brush or even a 3-inch goat hair brush will work just fine. You could even use a soft watercolor 1-inch brush. But I'm going to keep this just in case. I don't know if I'll use it, but just in case. We're going to go ahead again and very quickly, let's see if we got one of these. We're going to start to now I got to be careful with this type of charcoal. Sometimes when you use this type of charcoal, I just turn this so I can get into a couple places a little easier. Sometimes it can scratch. So again, these are just sticks that have been turned into charcoal. So we do have to be a little careful with them. So because since this is a graphite drawing, now if this was charcoal, we wouldn't worry about it. Because charcoal doesn't care if the surface of your paper is all messed up. Graphite does. It's the high, you know, maintenance medium of the art world. If there's any sort of problems with the paper, it's not going to like you, and it won't go down as smooth. And once the paper has been damaged, the drawing will always look damaged in that area. There's no saving it. And so we want to be a little careful with this as we're doing this. Now they do have charcoal powder that you can use. Many times I just don't know if I don't know what the charcoal is, I don't know that I want to be using the powder, because if I use compressed charcoal, it's going to just be too dark, and compressed charcoal doesn't, you know, it's harder to get out. This we want to be able to just kind of put this down and create like a silver, a light silver gray that we can then use for our drawing. We're not trying to go, you know, we don't want something that's, we're looking for something that's about a step, 8 on the value scale is what I'm looking for. And so this will just give me a base for that. Again, this is just the shadow shape for this rock that I've got lit. I've got it lit with 3/4 or almost profile lighting as far as that goes. And again, if I had to do this by hand with the graphite, we'd be here for almost an hour just trying to get the graphite to build up to this layer. So again, this is just to help us get started with some of the basic values. So there's sort of a half tone in here that I'm going to go ahead, and I want that half tone to have some value on it. This is also a little bit, it's not uniform as much as I would like, so I'm going to come over here and put a second layer. That's one thing about charcoal. So graphite, many times, it takes a while to build it up, but it goes down smoother. And I could certainly take more time with this, but the way we're going to get this smoother is we're just going to go and you're going to use layers, overlap layers, blend it, overlap layers, blend it, and so that's how I'm going to do this. And that's, with charcoal, if you're trying to get nice even tone, even if you're using a chemise or some really sophisticated sort of thing, usually you're going to have to do it at least twice. There's other times where if you're using stuff that's not near as nice as a chemise, I believe is how they say it, which is just a deer leather, a very soft deer leather as I understand it. I don't really use, I don't do enough charcoal for me to really go and get a chemise. I've never found to be all that exciting, in terms of, but some people love them, and that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It just means for me, I personally just don't use it. Is where we're going with that. Sometimes people are like, wait a minute, no, what's wrong with the chemise? Nothing's wrong with the chemise. It's all good. If you use a chemise that works for you, then work it, use it. Don't listen to, that's just my personal preference. And so there's certain things that I prefer that most people are like, I don't really prefer that. And there's a lot. So there's like different tools, lots of different tools to create lots of different looks in drawing. And you don't, just because one person uses it doesn't mean that it's the best tool out there for you, but just because someone doesn't use it doesn't mean it's not a good tool for you. So it's part of it is just kind of playing with techniques and things and getting to know what works for you. And because there's literally dozens if not hundreds of techniques in things like graphite and charcoal. And there's just so many techniques, and usually artists will use only a handful, like maybe a dozen at the most, of all the different techniques out there. And they'll gravitate towards what they like, and they'll gravitate towards what looks good for their technique and what they're trying to accomplish and all this good stuff. And why wouldn't they? And so, yeah, part of the fun of drawing is experimenting, so you can figure out what does work for you, what you like, what you enjoy. What makes, what you think that the drawing is going to, you're going to just tap that to get some of the, when I'm rubbing this, of course we're going to get, this is just tissue paper. So little bits of tissue paper come off. That's what that little thing is. So we'll tap this again, but we're just trying to get this as uniform as possible to start off with. And I think we're there as far as that goes. So this is just a basic, this is the light and dark of this particular rock. We're going to put in a basic cast shadow. I might even, since I'm here, I might as well probably use this. And it's just going to be a very basic cast shadow as far as that goes. It'd come over here, it would come around, it'd come out here. And so there's our cast shadow. I'm probably going to have to at least darken a little bit the underside so I can at least see where the underside of this rock is, where I've put it. Actually, I think that's correct. Yeah, that is correct. Okay. So that was a straight line. That's all right. As you're drawing, that's what you're going to be identifying. Oh, that's the one I wanted. Nope, that's not the one I wanted. Oh, that was part of my sketch, but it's not gonna stay there. And so that's what that was a reassessment. Okay, so again, we could go ahead and yes, I could put this on, like, you know, speed the time up by 3 or 4 and really take my time to make this as uniform as I possibly could stand to do. And there would be times I would do that, but this is going to be graphite, which means we're going over it with quite a few layers. So the fact, I'm not worried, basically. This is just a tone to anchor the drawing. Okay, so again, we're going to go over this and over it a few times. It's graphite. With graphite, it's really about building up your darks. And so your lights you may not go into all that much, but your darks you really get in there and maybe give a little nod to the, I believe it's the penumbra. It's been a while since I've used that technical term, but it just means that the shadow gets softer as it moves away, and as it gets closer, it gets a little sharper, the edge of the cast shadow. So I'm just already trying to build some of that in here. And again, I think that's called the penumbra. But it's basically just that effect of the shadow, the cast shadow, as it gets further from the object, it gets a less crisp edge. It gets a softer edge. And I'm just trying to put just a little bit of that on here now. I'm not going to lose sleep over it, but I'm just trying to get some of that in there right now. This is sharper. That'll be left a little softer. That's all we're trying to do. We'll tap this drawing again, get the junk off of it. I'm going to go ahead and brush this off. Okay. And now we're going to start drawing with our graphite. So I'm going to go ahead. The workhorse of the graphite world is usually an HB pencil. Now, I'm going to be using some of this stick for a lot of this. Now, this is a Derwent. These are a little harder to find sometimes. And this is a charcoal stick that's about like a 2H, somewhere between an H and a 2H. And so it's most of your graphite sticks are really dark. They're like a 2B or a 4B or a 6B. Again, where this is quite a bit lighter. And that's kind of nice because, again, you can cover more area with just a lighter tone of graphite. And there's times like this when that's what I would want. This is more of a 4B. I actually can't remember. This is just, so you can get what are called woodless pencils. And they're basically just a shaft of solid graphite with a little bit of either shellac or plastic to protect the graphite from breaking. So there's no wood in this, and that just means you got a thicker piece of graphite to play with. And so many times I'll take these like this, where I've carved off that black plastic or shellac, and now I have a graphite stick. So, you know, these, and they're nice because I like the rounds. Otherwise, I have to take the square sticks and I have to round them off, or I have to do other sorts of things. And so I just like this. Now again, this will help me cover because this is, you know, much more graphite here, much more surface area. I can cover much more area much more quickly using this graphite pencil. Okay, and I want some of that in the beginning. We want to have some, you know, do this as quickly as possible. We want to have, you know, be economical with our time. And again, there's ways that we can save time with graphite. This is one of them. Okay, so again, I'm not here to just play with the cast shadow, but you know, we do want to give that a nod. There's also going to be a little bit where this touches. There's going to be, again, you're going to see me turn this around as I work. It's just sort of the way I work, especially with graphite. But where this object touches the ground, there's something that we call the occlusion shadow, and the occlusion shadow is where something touches another surface, and it's the darkest part of the drawing. Usually it's near the cast shadow, and so again, you'd look for, again, where something touches something else. These dark lines between my fingers is where the skin is puckering together and creating occlusion shadows. So we want some of that. As we're drawing, we're going to be looking for some of that. So I'm not gonna, you know, again, I'm not here to I'm not gonna sit there and lose sleep over it, but I want some of it in the drawing, as far as that goes. I'm gonna go ahead and we're gonna start to look for the different types of value. So, in a general way, so we've got light versus dark, and then we're gonna start putting in some of the, you know, the reflected light versus the dark values versus are there any core shadows? These are planes, and yet some of these are rounded enough that we might start to have, you know, not just a plane change where you get that crisper edge, but something that starts to, you know, become a bit of a core shadow. And so we're going to start to deal with this in just a general way. So first off, I'm not going to worry about the core shadow as much because it's not that round. But what I am going to do is I'm going to leave this a little lighter because this is reflected light. And if I wanted to, I could go ahead and create the shape of the reflected light in this rock. And it does something about like this. So this will be lighter and the rest of it around it will be darker because we have basically dark tones and reflected light in a flat object. Like so again, I said, well, there might be some core shadows. There's a couple places. This is round enough, maybe. This is round enough, maybe. Maybe along this ridge, maybe. But everything else, there's not going to be any core shadows on it. So because this rock has a combination of, you know, flat and some combination of round, we want to be looking for 6 different types of value. Now there may not be 6. It might be, I might look at it and go, it's straight enough that no, there is no true core shadow. I doubt that would be the case, but it could happen. Now again, this has a rock that has a little fissure in it. And again, where those 2 pieces of stone start to come together deep within the rock, that's going to create an occlusion shadow. So we're going to go ahead and put that occlusion shadow in there. There's also another fissure in this rock right through here. And again, where that touches, there's going to be an occlusion shadow. So I'm going to, now I don't want it too dark. Right now it looks way too dark. I'll be the first one to say yes, it looks way too dark. But everything else is going to go darker. So this isn't black. I don't want you to think don't put it down like it looks like you got a Sharpie marker and started, you know, going nuts. We don't want that. That's not going to help the drawing whatsoever. But we do want to you know, put those in very lightly, very gently, so that we do start to have something that looks like it has some sort of depth. So again, we're just going to keep on keeping on, as some people might say. We're going to go ahead and darken for these dark tones. I'm going to be taking my eyes out of focus as I look at the object. I'm going to be, you know, trying my best to judge the value and the shape of the value, because that's all it is to create a realistic drawing. It's just about what's the value, what's the shape, what's the value, what's the shape, value, shape, value, shape, value, shape. Oh, by the way, did I mention it's value and shape? That's all there is to it. And that sounds much easier than what it is, and I understand that. But by the same token, I want you to always try to look for the shape. Always ask yourself, what's the value? The more you do that, the better off your drawing will be. I guarantee you. That's usually where, if we have a problem in our drawing, most times, and it doesn't feel three-dimensional because we're talking about form shadows here, it's because we have a value in the wrong place, or the value isn't the right value, or the shape isn't the right shape of that value. And so again, as we're dealing with these ideas, we want to constantly be looking, constantly keep our. So when we're drawing, like 90%, and I tell my students this all the time, 90% of the time you want to keep a soft eye, or in other words, squint. Take your eye out of focus. You will see better value if you take your eye out of focus than if you keep it in. If you focus your eye, you see more detail, but you lose value relationships. So, and the biggest thing to create something that looks three-dimensional is to have the correct value relationships. And so that's what we want. We want to have the best, the correct values and the right shapes. And in order to do that, we're going to keep our eyes very soft. In fact, about through 90% of the drawing. The last 10% of the drawing is, okay, and now I'm going to sharpen my eyes and put the little details in. Okay, so I want you to understand that the most of your drawing is with that soft eye. Most of your drawing, you have your eye out of focus. And if you do that, you'll start to have drawings that have much more depth, because the details conform to form shadows. Always remember, the details conform to form shadows. What does that mean? Details in the light are going to get lighter. Details in the shadow will get lost. So if you have everything with the same amount of detail, with the same amount of contrast, between the details, it starts to flatten out. And there's a movement of hyperrealism these days, where they're trying to go beyond photorealism, go into hyperrealism. But you have to do it. Sometimes people think they're just copying photographs, and that's how they do it. And the best hyperrealist knows, or has learned from doing enough drawings, that if you draw everything the eye sees and you don't have what's called a hierarchy, meaning some things lighter, some things less bright, some things a little darker, or details. There's areas of detail that get blown out in the lights. More in the middle values is where you see them the most, and then they get lost in the shadows. If you do that, you'll have a hyper-realistic drawing that looks even more hyper-real. If you don't, it'll start to look like a mannequin, especially if you're drawing a person. It'll start to look like, it'll start to look like a mannequin. It won't look real. It'll be something weird, something a little strange. Sometimes you can't even put your finger on it. And so you want to be aware of that. When people are doing CGI work and stuff like that, for the really high-end movies, they have to be careful that the computer doesn't render it too perfect, because everybody's faces, to some degree, in some way, has a bit of asymmetry. And if everything is too symmetrical, again, it starts to create like this strange illusion where it looks like you're looking at something out of a wax museum. It doesn't look like a real person. And that's why, still to this point, I've yet to see a close-up CGI figure that doesn't look strange, because of that whole idea. That no one's been able to pull it off yet. And so we'll see if anyone ever does, but it'd have to be someone who'd take enough care to put the asymmetry back into the person, plus the way they move, plus the way they do this, that, and the other, the way that physics, affects the way they move. I mean, there's lots of things when you start going into, like CGI work. But the idea is that you have to be aware of that stuff. Otherwise, your end product's going to suffer. And so you want to be careful about that. And that's why there's certain, animated features, some of them by beloved people, children's book authors and other things, that have gone and turned them into movies. And it was a few years ago or what have you, but it just doesn't work. The people just start to look strange and a little disembodied. And you got to be, again, it's the same thing with this. It's all because of the fact that it's some of the fact with the detail stuff I'm talking about. It's also some of that fact that there's none of the asymmetry going on, and then there's also the thing about parts not, and movements not working the way that we are used to seeing them, because we're surrounded by people all the time. We're surrounded by living things that walk and live and breathe, and we know how they look on an intuitive level. We may not, think about it when we're drawing sometimes, but on an intuitive level, we know, hey, that looks right, or hey, that looks weird. Which is probably important that we learned that early on from our ancestors, that we could detect that, because that would be like, oh, that person's okay, or from a distance you go, there's something seriously wrong with that person. Get out of here before they can get to you. There's something, something's not right. Maybe they had, rabies or something. But you wanted to be able to see that from a distance, because if you got too close, you might contract it. And so I think we, for whatever reason, we're very, very aware of stuff that looks right versus stuff that doesn't look right, even from something like a distance. You know, that's probably what saved our ancestors from going, is that a horse running at me, or is that a tiger? Being able to know that, you know, quite a ways away was the difference between surviving and not surviving. And so, you know, it's, I know I kind of got off topic, but whenever we're drawing, we want to be looking for these basic relationships. It's not in the details. It's in the basic shadows. And if the shadows are right, well, then you can start adding details and little blemishes and little stuff. And, you know, it's hard, but it's harder than what it looks like. People have, it becomes a balancing act. How much is too much? If this is this much contrast, what about the thing next to it? You know, I've seen people that start to do hyperrealism, people's skin starts to look like stucco, or it's, you know, something strange like that, or some rock pulled out of a river. You know, it's just too rough, and it looks like if you put your hand over it, you'd pull back a bloody stump, and that's usually not a good sign for the drawing. That usually means that, you know, it's too harsh. And so even when you're doing things, so you're doing it when you're stylizing, you're doing it when you're doing, you know, impressionistic stuff, but you're also doing it when you're doing the same stuff when you're doing photorealism and hyperrealism and these different sorts of things. They still are built on these ideas of, you know, of value. It's all about the value. It's all about the shapes. That's how it works. Oh, that's right. We're doing, I was using it like charcoal for a second. Where I was just like, oh, I'll just skip it and then I'll just blend it. It'll be fine. But no, we're using graphite. So I'm going to brush this a little bit because that area there was just a little too rough. Again, I wasn't thinking, and it's going to show. So I went ahead and soften that up. Going to come back into that. You never brush something or blend something and then leave it. You always have to come back in. Otherwise, it's going to look terrible. So again, we don't want this looking terrible. We want this looking good. So again, we're going to go ahead and, you know, again, try to get this to work. All right. The last thing we have to remember is to have fun. Sometimes, you know, we're doing this and it could just seem like, oh my goodness, this is just, you know, this is not fun. Sometimes we have to remind ourselves that we're having a good time, or, you know, to find the joy back into it, because that's something else too. We want to enjoy these things. We don't want to just. This is a 4H pencil, by the way, and I'm going to use this to sort of. So I'm roughing in, as we call it, with those graphite sticks, but there's a point at which we're going to come in here with some graphite pencils, and that's what I'm doing now. What I'm doing is I want to make sure there's like a little halo. We're going to try to get rid of the halo. We're also going to try to, your H pencils get very, very smooth bits of value. So it's easier to fill in very smoothly with an H pencil or the H family of pencils. And so I could do that. I could even see, now this again, as I said, is like an H pencil. I could go ahead and see if I can do it with this. Now the way that they make H pencils is they add, I've been told they add clay to the graphite. If I don't make pencils though, so I'm not sure, but that's what I've been told. So that's what I, you know, pass on to people, is that I believe that's what they do. Sometimes this, and it's it's hard. It doesn't say 2H. It's just Derwent hard. But that Derwent's about like, again, like a 2H or an H pencil, one of those two. But it's really weird. It's very crumbly as you make, you know, the graphite dust that comes off of stuff. It just, this stuff seems like whatever they're using, it seems even more different than this. So that's, you know, that's something to be to look for, because that might mean it might change your drawing in some way. Because of the fact that I'm going to be going over this so many times, I'm not that worried about it. But, you know, again, now what I'm doing is I'm using an elbow swing. I'm not even using a wrist swing. So I'm using an elbow swing to cover more area much more quickly with this graphite. And, you know, that's what we want to do, is cover more area much more quickly. All right, so we're going to again look through here. We're going to try to get the basic. These are darker, they're getting a little bit lighter. You know, it's going to be lighter here because the light source is coming from this side. Okay, so it's coming from this direction here, and then this is going to be darker. So even the shadows will be a little lighter here, a little darker over here, all that good stuff. We're just going to keep developing this. All right, let's get in here. So I think, again, maybe I'll use some of this up here just a little bit. And I'm going to bring in some of the middle values. So there's some middle values on this rock that we want to deal with. And it's not going to be completely white up here. And so we're going to start putting in some of these middle values. And the middle values are in the light family. Okay, so, and they're going to start, and we're going to start to look for what the shapes are. So I'm going to keep my eyes out of focus. I'm going to look at, you know, certain areas, you know, that, oh, this is a little darker shape as it comes across here, and this is slightly lighter than that. Now it's very, you know, it's very general in the beginning. We get more and more and more detailed, but we start off in the you know, what's the basic shape of these middle values? This comes across here, attaches to that. This comes up here and gets thinner, sort of like a long triangle. Again, I'm going to keep your eyes out of focus, and you're going to start trying to, this is kicking up, so that's catching more light, so there's different stuff like that. I'm going to use a little bit of this 4H. That was using a wrist swing. I think I'm going to come over here and create more of a, I don't know, I'm actually using a wrist swing. If I need a little more detail, I'll use a wrist swing. If I want to cover more area, like now I'm going to use more of a elbow swing. So again, we're just using this for different areas. We're just using it to make different values, different tones. And for the most part, we're focusing on that middle value family. That's the value that's just lighter than when it comes out of shadow. Now I've got to be careful because I don't want to lose the shadows. There's been because we darken graphite, and because of the way I'm doing this, I've just obscured a couple places where the shadow stops and the light starts. Because again, we're dealing with these middle values, and I'm going to have to go back at some point and put those back in, or I've lost, you know, the light and shadow relationship, which gives something form, gives something substance. It's what it's going to make it, you know, make it look real, as people might say. So we're going to have to go back and darken the shadows. As long as I keep that in mind, that's not a big deal. It's when we're just kind of turn our brain off and we go on, put it into cruise mode or something, that we can start to lose it a little bit. So again, we're going to come in here. And these are really great things. And I remember back in the day, when I was a younger man, or even, I was you know, a teenager really. What got me into art was some of the really great illustrators that of the books I would read and stuff like that. And you know, I would you know, read these different, you know, books and see these great illustrations and things. And I remember you know, some of these illustrations were just fantastic, you know, and you'd be like, man, how do they do that? And it'd be like this, you know, like a castle on a cliffside or something, you know, some extraordinary, you know, sort of event where the, you know, where the evil mage or whatever it was called lived, and, you know, all these different things. But I would be like, man, how do they do that? And we know, I'm sure you've seen, you know, and know there's certainly illustrators around these days that have created different books on fantastical worlds that, you know, have turned into movies and other things. And one of them that keeps a very a great blog on his painting adventures, and painting all kinds of things, and just an extraordinary artist. But what I'm getting at is there was a purpose to the whole conversation. I know you'd be like, well, okay, where's it going with this? But I remember, so you had I remember this one with this cliffside with this amazing castle and all this sort of thing, and it was this big rocky cliff face, and I was wondering, I was like, wow, how do they do it? And I saw a book years later by a particular artist, and it was showing, he was a fantasy artist, and he was showing how you would create a scene like this, that you're basically inventing it, and this was before CGI, this was before 3D programs, there was no Strata Pro or whatever, there was barely even CAD. I mean, this was back in the 80s and the late 70s that this person was working, and so it was all about, how do you do this? You're seriously creating stuff that doesn't exist, and how do you do it? And he was showing this painting, this particular painting that I'd seen before, and I was like, wow, that's pretty extraordinary stuff. And he showed how he did it, and what's cool about it, and this is where it dovetails into what we're doing, is he's like, yeah, I needed this this really rocky face, and he had like this type of amethyst and a couple pieces of like petrified wood or something, and so just these small pieces, about yay big, and he set those down, and from those he was able to construct what looked like this big range of pointy mountains, because he set up these different rocks, and then using those rocks as a jumping off point, he was able to then create from his imagination, and by reconstructing and by putting these rock surfaces together in different ways to create this painting of this very believable range of jagged rocky mountains and things. And so it was really quite spectacular, but it was amazing to me. It was just like, because I understand how rocks work, and because I understand the basic idea of rocks, how they have to be jagged enough, and they have to be irregular enough, and they have to be, have these different things. Some of the characteristics we've talked about here, he was then able to take an actual rock, because sometimes you need a little bit more than just imagination. Sometimes you need a subject, a model, and this was his model for the mountains, were these rocks he had, and so he constructed the mountain range, and he probably had some shots of ranges and stuff like that as well. I'd be shocked if he didn't, but he was able to create an entirely new range of mountains and things from these photographs that he had in studio, and then was able to complete this illustration for this particular client. And so, and this is nothing new. I remember when we were in when I was in art history, and we were talking about an artist that was in the Renaissance. I don't even know what I was just using. Oh, a 6B. So I was darkening those darks with a 6B. Sorry if I'm not keeping up on the pencils I'm using. I'm just grabbing one. I'm like, ooh, that needs to be darker. And so a lot of times I won't even look at the pencil. It's just if the pencil isn't dark enough or not light enough or not doing what I want, I'll grab another one. But if you haven't had my classes before, well, then it might be a little bit less clear as to why. But I'm just switching back and forth based on whether it's dark enough for the area that I'm trying to work in. And if it's not, I grab something that's darker. If it's too dark, then I grab something that's lighter. And it's really no different than that. That's how I work. This right now is a 6B, and I was, so I was just talking, I was just saying that, it was amazing how they could take this and create, these different these different scenarios, for lack of a better word. But again, I was in an art history class, and we were talking about in the Renaissance, and there was a certain artist, and I can't remember which one it was. I don't think it was Pontormo, but it was one of these artists from the Renaissance, probably mid part of the 15th century, or pardon me, the 16th century. I think it was about 1500 through I think 1550 is when this person lived. But they were talking about how his studio was just like what we think of as a movie studio today. Because back in the day, artists were the directors and the movie makers of the time. People would, come from all over just to see people's work. It's hard to think of now because, I'm sure these days people are like, man, there's nothing more boring than being in a museum or something. And pardon me. And but then that was the entertainment. That was what they had. That was things that just like and I'm sure the books they had didn't have too many books back then either. So it was these paintings that actually captivated the imagination. It was these paintings that transported people into different realms, different different ideas of, and of course many of them were connected to the church and these different things. And so there were a lot of these were epic struggles of good versus evil, and depictions of things from the Bible that you would hear in this different sermons and things. But still, this gentleman would set up these elaborate, like he would have, very elaborate paintings of, of Mary and the Annunciation, angels, and all these different things, and so very, very complex. And so he would have, and they have it recorded, him talking about this. I don't mean recorded on like a, his voice recorded, but in his journal and notes that he would take on the way he ran his studio. He was very meticulous, and so he would talk about the models that he would, that he had hired and how much he'd paid them. So just really good note taking on the business. And he would describe the scenes that they would build. So they'd actually get carpenters in there and things like that, and they would build these vast scenes, and they would have these cords and these ropes and these riggings that they would hang, models from with wings that they'd had built to look like angel wings, and again using that as really good solid reference to then for the artist's eye to then go and make it look real. And so he would build these very expansive little sets for what he was doing. And he's not the only one that did that. There's other artists who, if they're doing 100 different angels and different things, and some of them didn't have the money, but some of the really best did, and so the others had to kind of visualize more. They couldn't hire 10 models at a time to come in and have people come in and swing them from riggings. And so certain artists didn't have that same money, so they'd have to just okay, I'm going to put this person on the floor, and I'm going to use one person and change them up 10 different ways, and then maybe use 10 people, but then change them up 100 different ways for the 100 different angels that they were painting on this ceiling that spiraled up into heaven or something. So I want you to understand, not everyone was, but it was not uncommon for people to have, again, these studios. And the same thing in the 19th century. Again, there were artists that people would follow, just like people used to follow movie producers, as far as that goes. And people would just really be excited about the newest artwork by a certain artist, and they would just fill the museums. It was like an opening of some big film, some big blockbuster, and there was a lot of that was going on. And so when people talk about like the Hudson River Valley School, these were artists that inspired the national parks. These were people that did things that were so fantastic, that places that people hadn't really seen. 130 years ago, 140 years ago, most people didn't even know about this place. Places like the Grand Tetons or or Yellowstone, that's now a national park, but there was a time where it wasn't. And these artists and explorers went out there and then brought their findings back to Congress, and based on their sketches and based on what they had done, that the people realized that this was something that needed to be preserved. It was something that was unique. Maybe unfortunately these days people are starting to, that there are certain people that don't realize that as much, which is a shame, but we need to keep those spaces, because they are unique. They are something that, that deserve to be preserved. And as an artist, I feel that very deeply, especially as an artist that works in the national parks, going and recording and being inspired by these amazing places that have inspired, mankind for, many, many generations. And so, but anyways, sorry, as we kind of got off track there for a second. I don't find it off track, because I think it's something that's very important to an artist and to the arts in this day and age. But there's something very important about places that are kept, that are unique and that inspire and that stay that way for the generations to come, so to speak. So again, we're just going to keep building up, And we can start to see that this is, you know, we're starting to get a nice quality to this rock. So again, now I've got this 4H pencil. The reason I'm using the 4H pencil is it has a little less sheen. I want to make sure that, you know, the one thing about graphite, and it can be hard to light and work in sometimes because of the sheen that graphite has, and I'm trying to minimize that. And there's a lot of reasons that, you know, some people don't like graphite because of quote unquote the sheen issue. And there's ways to control that. Part of that is to use your B pencils less. If you don't use your B pencils, though, you're not going to have any darks. But but if you're like, well, how could I do it with and make it less shiny? Well, graphite always has a certain sheen, but the H pencils have less sheen than the B pencils, and part of that is whatever they put in with the graphite to make it harder also makes it less shiny. And so by layering and building up and layering and building up, you can start to get something that's got far less sheen to it than, now that's a 4H. I'm going to grab a 2H because that's a little darker, because that 4H is just not dark enough. So again, this is the time where you're like, oh, it's too light. Grab a different pencil. So again, we're just going to go ahead and push this back down, so to speak. I'm also, I think, going to soften it, so we're just going to, ooh, wow. Yeah, so I think I talked about how this is a little more powdery. And I don't know if you saw that when I brushed that, lots of powder came off, and that almost never happens with graphite. It's because of this bad boy. If I had the time, I'd actually get into this, and I'd cover all this with an H pencil, because again, those H pencils, unlike this, aren't as powdery. They won't just fly up and dust off the same way that this does. So I'm going to actually get a different pencil now. And again, we're starting to get something that's looking a little bit like the rock. I'm not going to sit here and go too nuts with this. But we do want to be able to, again, get something that's looking like that rock. So again, I'm going to go ahead and this looks too much. It has to come out a little bit more. It kind of has a hook to it. And there's no hook, so we need to hook this around. All right. And if I take my eyes out of focus, there's a part of this dark value that comes up into here. I don't think got dark enough, so I'm going to darken that back. This is about like an HB, is what this pencil I've got right here is, an HB or a B. I actually don't have it on here, so it might even be as much as a 2B, but I don't think it's a 4B. So, but it's just it's dark enough to actually do some of this stuff, and that's all I'm looking for at the moment. As far as that goes. And let's see, where's a regular 2B? Or not 2B, but a regular, well actually this is a 2B. Okay, so let's go ahead and using a finger swing now. As far as that goes, I'm going to go ahead and bring this in to darken some of these areas that need just a little bit more dark to them. I'm taking my eyes out of focus again. I'm double checking how dark is this versus this. You know, there's wonderful variations in here, and we just want to make sure that we've got some of those variations happening. Okay. All right. There's like a little, there's a shape in here that's kind of like, there's a little bit of a curl, and then almost like an eye, you know, like a very formal sort of Times Roman sort of eye that's on the side. So you got a little tail, so it's got serifs on it, comes out here, it dips here, there's a little tail there, and it's a little notch in the rock. And again, I just want to make sure that that notch is there. Now that maybe got a little dark, and so I'm going to get my little tissue, I think, and we're going to go ahead and just lighten that by, again, if you're not, and I'm going to be going back over this. So again, you don't just usually just wipe and leave with a graphite. If you do, it's usually going to not look too good. I could come over here again. This is still has this little ghost line there that we didn't quite get rid of, and when I wiped it, it wiped up because I used a lot of that 2H graphite stick, and so it wiped off a lot of that and left the line back. Well, guess what? I can come back in here with a what have I got? Oh, this is a 2H. I had a 2B. I put down the 2B, and now I'm using a 2H. And the reason I've got the 2H is because, again, it's a little less shiny, but you can also build it up very slowly because it's a harder pencil. So you have to go over and over and over twice as many times, but that means you have more control as you build that up. So I'm going to go ahead and come over in here. I'm actually going to just flip this completely upside down. Okay. I'll just flip this back again. I know you're probably, wait, what's going on? Again, I just needed to darken some stuff, and so yeah, I just needed to go ahead and flip it upside down to get that done. When I take my eyes out of focus, once I do that, I start to see there's like, again, sort of a little bit of another sort of eye shape, like we were doing the one before, that's darker, a little darker than every other one. And again, so it's all about shape and value. What's the value? What's the shape? Then there's a little C-curve over here that I need. And the C-curve kind of straightens out. So again, what's the value? What's the shape? C-curves, we got all kinds of stuff. And again, that original occlusion shadow has now disappeared. Now there's not just an occlusion shadow, there's also a cast shadow. There's a deepening right next to that occlusion shadow. And we're going to go ahead and start putting some of that in. Okay. This isn't, again, the darkest part. This is the cast shadow that's being cast on the, on this little ridge, as this is on a plane going back in, like so. And then we're going to go ahead and darken it at the occlusion shadow. So again, occlusion shadow is next to the cast shadow. We have the cast shadow we put in there, and then we're going to put in this. Again, this occlusion shadow, and the occlusion shadow has different, the line gets thicker and the line gets a little thinner, and it gets a little, it's a little irregular, and it scoops in and it carves out and all this sort of stuff. And so again, we want to be aware of that as we're creating this. We want this to have that same sort of undulation if you got, a word calendar or whatever, or, you get the words of the day in your email or what have you. But the idea is that, yeah, it's got some very interesting depth, and we want to capture some of the same sort of stuff. And why wouldn't we? It's fascinating, it's interesting, it's good stuff. This is a little bit too bright down here, I think. Then there's a bit that's actually a little darker, while this ridge is a little bit lighter. And so we're going to go ahead and put that in there. All this wonderful rich value in these shadows, is going to really help this this rock to look like a rock and all that good stuff. Let's put this where you can actually see where I'm working. Again, I've got this, I think I grabbed the 2B again, yes, because I wanted a little bit more dark in some of the area where I'm working now. So we can go ahead and continue working on this. This gets lighter, and then on this edge it gets a little darker. So again, there's also what we call lost and found edge. That's a good example of it, where one part of it gets a little lighter and then it starts getting darker again, and so the edge starts to sort of disappear a little bit, then it gets hit harder with a darker dark, and then it disappears again, then it gets hit a little darker, and that's the idea. I'm going to turn this way for my occlusion shadow that's down here that we can now darken. And maybe even in the cast shadow, there's a place in the cast shadow close to the light. Again, it gets lighter usually as it moves away from the shadow too. So there's a place down here where it actually is a little darker coming out from that occlusion shadow. And then as it moves this direction, it's going to be getting lighter. So we've got that going on. And this is fun. We're starting to have a little bit of, where it's starting to look like it's embracing its inner rockness. It's starting to look a little bit like a rock. And that's the fun part, where the thing starts to actually look like, what we're trying to draw. Never a bad thing to look like what we're trying to draw. I don't care who you are. Usually that's a win. And that's where we're starting to get here. We're like, yes, it's starting to come together. And that's the exciting part too. That's where we're like, yes, that is the exciting part. There's a little shelf out here again that's going to have a little bit of a cast shadow. And most of this probably is cast shadow. I don't even think I can actually see maybe the occlusion shadow. So this would be more of the cast shadow running along there. Again, it's appropriate that I'm drawing this in Idaho, because it's starting to look like all of a potato. I'll let you decide whether or not that works for your own personal aesthetic, whether you think I need to change it and not make it look like a potato. I just kind of smile and go, yeah, doesn't that look, isn't that appropriate for where I live, that it's looking a little bit like, a potato. So we're going to go ahead and this gets a little darker. I'm taking my out of focus, and again, I'm trying to get just a little bit more information here. This could probably go in a couple places just a little bit darker. So again, lost and found lines. So parts of it are going darker, parts of it are getting a little lighter. It makes it look a little better. I mean, if I wanted to, this is still a little bit early in the game, but if you want to, you could start to put some of the little holes in the rock in little places and start to deal a little bit with some of the texture. Do we want texture everywhere? Probably not, because again, we don't want to. But again, the funny thing is if you don't do this right, this is going to start to look like eyes. Like again, this is a potato, as far as that goes. But you can start to make some shapes that start to deal with the fact that there's some fissures in here, and there's some little holes in here, and so there's even some some mineral and things that are lighter and darker. So you could start to that was probably a little bit too much, but that's all right. We'll go ahead and you could start to put in some very soft ideas of detail, and you want to keep them random. The hardest thing with this is a lot of times we don't like randomness. If our heartbeat is random, we're in a whole lot of trouble. But when we're doing details, we have to make sure again that they're much more random. If we're doing like the somebody's skin, or if in this case we're doing again the mineral deposits on the rock and things. If we make everything the same, it's going to the same shape. It's going to go flat. If we start making everything the exact, some people, again, I could tap on this to give some of these little specks on here. This can be kind of fun. You could do a little what's called stippling, where you're taking the pencil and doing that. You don't want too much of that, because again, it'll start to look like freckles or something. But a little bit of that might be a nice way to start to create, again, some texture and keep it random and these different things. This is my darkest pencil in my, the sticks. And again, you could just, you know, so we could start to deal with the fact that there's a little bit of texture going on here. Again, I don't want to go too far into that because again, it can start to upstage the form shadows, but just a little bit of it here and there can be, you know, can be nice. It can be, oh yeah, okay, that's going to add to the look of this rock. I wish I knew my, you know, my geology a little better so we could talk about the type of rock. But the texture, I'm sure, I don't know that this, you know, I don't know what this rock is made of, but it reminds me of granite. The texture that's on it reminds me of granite. There's dark splotches, iron, you know, deposits in there, and there's probably some deposits of quartz in there and some other things, but who knows. But again, very, very, very cool. We can start to, again, get this to start looking like a rock. As we come up here again, we're going to have some of that too. There's going to be some of this, you know, some of these, you know, little splotches. So again, we could go ahead and start to put some of that on. We can start looking for some values. What I have, that's a 2B, that's too dark. I'm going to grab a 2H because I want to make sure that I keep this on the lighter side. And I can even use marks. So instead of just using straight marks, well, now I can be using like little curlicues that are going to again start to leave spaces that can start to look like, again, those little textures. So again, we can go ahead and just by the different type of mark we make start to indicate more detail is the word I'm looking for. A little bit of detail to give it just a little bit more, again, feeling of the fact that it's a rock. I'm going to take my eyes out of focus because again, the details have to conform to the form shadows. So like this is lighter because this is, again, kicking up into the light. This is flat and dished and it gets a little darker here. And so again, I can start to again make little, you know, some sort of little circles to kind of help to create the illusion of that irregular surface. This might be too dark. It starts to be as dark as that. That's a problem. It's going to start looking like it's not in the light. So I'm going to wipe some of that away to lighten that. That's better. And then we're going to come over here and we're going to break that up because that's probably too flat. So we're going to, you know, put some texture in there again to go with our little rockiness to make it look like a rock. We're also going to start to look where is it the lightest, and there's a couple places where the light actually starts to pick up some of these ridges, and we need some of that. So we're going to go ahead and, you know, pick up the sort of the edge. It's a rounded edge, but it's an edge nonetheless where the light and shadow meet. And so we're going to come over here and we're start to deal with that ridge line again where the light and shadow meets as far as that goes. So like that, again, we can start to, you know, look at this, and there's again going to be some little spaces, some little splotches. There's going to be some, you know, there's going to be some details. So right now the light, now you can actually start to do sometimes where the light gets completely blown out, but this I don't think there's nothing there. So that means that has no information. That's not going to be good either. So it's again it's a balancing act. If this is in the light values, again the details are going to be blown out a little bit by the light. So we don't want it to get too dark, and if it does, we have to come over there and then start to pull it back out. Again, we can come over here if something gets too splotchy, you know, where it goes just a little too flat. We can soften it just by, you know, stroking it, which is going to basically, you know, blow out the darks just slightly. So again, this is how you can start to control, you know, your details that you have on your object. Again, this looks like it needs to be sort of a lighter middle value. Then we're going to have our light value definitely hits there, where it kind of blows out the detail. So again, most of your detail up here is going to be in what we call these middle values. And I'm going to start looking very, very, there's actually a little bit of a hump or a ridge right through here. Again, that just gets a little bit of dark on it. Again, I've got a 2H pencil. That was too dark. That's too much. So we're going to come over here with our kneaded eraser, and we're going to pull it out. I think I'll even soften it a little bit with the tissue, because we need it's not supposed to be a sharp ridge like these guys. It's much more soft. So I think that did what I wanted. We're just going to go ahead, and again, we're going to look at our values. And again, there's a little bit of a darker half tone right along here. So you have lighter halftone versus a little darker halftone. Darker halftone comes up here a little bit. So that's how we're going to continue to work on this. Halftone comes up onto here a little bit. And again, I could take another like 3 hours to really sort of get this wrestled into the drawing that I want. But I think there's enough here where you understand what we're going for. We're trying to get just enough information to, that was too bright. There was a little splotch back there that was too bright. There's sort of, again, a middle value. So again, we have to be careful. If it's lighter here than it is up here, they switch. This comes forward and that goes back. So that's what I did. I was darkening this so this stays forward. As I look over here, again, this needs to darken just a little bit. So this is lighter than that back there. So again, these little bits of form shadow. So things start to really, we want the lightest along that ridge. So again, if this is lighter, we want this just slightly darker. So we'll just push that back just a little bit. And again, we've got this where we're starting to get this rock. And again, if I wanted to, and you gotta be careful of this, once again, can't have as much details up here, but again, we have very little of the details. So we could start to, again, try to create some irregular marks, some of these darker splotches, again, these bits of iron that are in here, you know, and, you know, so we could start to, again, get some of this. We want it blown out along the ridge, though. If we're gonna do it, it's gonna be back here. Less here, more here, you know, that sort of thing. This is middle value, this is lighter middle value. So again, and I could come over here and we could, you know, again, do some little, you know, some little stippling just to sort of break it up just a bit. We could also come over here with our eraser. We could start to, again, pounce to lighten stuff up. But again, I'm probably going to have to start pushing it back too. So, you know, there's some of that we want going on. There's some striations here that are kind of fun that we could put in there. And again, now they're too light, so now we have to, got a 4H, we need to knock them back. So I'm going to go ahead and just put a little bit a tone or a flat value over the top of them. Some people try to say it like a wash. I'm like, no, this is not paint. That's fine if they say that, but what they really mean is we're going to put a flat value to knock something back. So again, when someone says a wash of value, I always kind of go, wait, what? This isn't watercolor. You know, how do you put a wash on? Now, I've actually done, I actually have done true washes in graphite, but it's when you have graphite suspended in alcohol or graphite suspended in water or something like that, and you're doing some sort of, you know, a mixed media or, you know, a variation of the media technique, trying to get the media to look a little different than what it actually looks like. And I certainly have done that, but that, you've got a brush. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I'm putting down a wash. Literally got a wash, literally loaded my brush with graphite and you know, an alcohol. And I'm going to be doing a wash. Again, that's more sort of a mixed media sort of thing. It can be very fun doing that sort of stuff. And I've seen you've seen some people doing this where they're you know, they're flicking you know, like they're flicking like alcohol into like a charcoal wash, and it creates this sort of an emulsion, and it has some really cool effects as it dries and stuff like that. So again, there's, you know, and I've seen more and more of it. That, you know, it's nothing new. It's not a new technique. It's been around for, you know, all kinds of time, and I'm sure it probably even goes back. There's sort of similar sorts of things that were done in the Renaissance 500 years ago. Were they using the exact same stuff? I don't have any idea, but they were using something to create an emulsion and you know, going into it and drawing into it and doing all this sort of fun stuff. And so there's very few things that are truly new in terms of drawing media. I mean, people have been picking up sticks and drawing stuff for centuries, you know, millennia even. And so, you know, it's hard to have something new when you've got something that is literally that old. And that's what's kind of nice. It's very deep in the race, so to speak, you know, that something that even our earliest ancestors, you know, were grabbing sticks out of the fire and making marks on the ground and making marks on the sides of caves and making marks on, you know, logs or whatever they could get, you know, or, you know, taking rocks and pounding it into the side of cliffs and making marks and you know, different things. And So anyways, it's kind of that's the wonderful thing about art, is it's nothing, it's not new either. People have been doing it as long as people could pick up instruments, and maybe it was to pass some of the very long winters or whatever, what have you. But for whatever it was, sometimes they say boredom is the mother of invention, and it certainly can be. If you're like, I'm bored, oh, let me try something. That's usually when magic would happen, is when you're like, oh, I'm just going to try something. And then usually sometimes you'll be like, not all the time, sometimes it's just like, oh, well, that was kind of whatever. But there are sometimes you're like, holy smokes, and you'll stumble onto something. And again, and we're not the first ones to do it. I'm sure that's how a lot of your invention was throughout time immemorial, as people might say. So again, we've got this rock that's finally looking like a rock. So we're going to go ahead. I think we could clean it up here a little bit using my kneaded eraser, coming around here and again just crisping up some of the different lines. Because again, if it feels too soft, it might start to feel a little less rock-like. So part of this might be controlling my edges, where you come over and you start crisping up edges to make it feel harder. Because if the edge is literally, sharper, it feels harder and therefore can feel more like a rock. If it starts to feel too soft, it might start to feel like, that maybe this isn't a rock. Maybe this is something else. Piece of bread dough or something. So how sharp or how clean the mark is can indicate and suggest what the actual thing is. And when you get into more advanced drawing and intermediate advanced, you really start paying attention to that. That's where you can really start to create some, not just illusions of depth, but you can actually start to describe the object as hard or soft. Again, going back to some hyperrealists will render their hair so much that the hair starts to feel like a Brillo pad. Again, it starts to feel so sharp, like you pull back a bloody stump if you touch the thing, And so that's usually not a good thing. You try to soften the hair a little bit so in relation to the other stuff it feels softer. If not, you got to be careful. If you start having rendering someone's lips and it starts to look like the skin of a crocodile, well, that might be fine for a Maybelline commercial, like before you use, there's certain type of chapstick or what have you, or whatever. But that's not that's not going to be what we want most likely for what we're doing. If you want to indicate something that's soft, and you have something that looks very, very harsh, like dried brick, well, that might not work too well. So again, here we've got our completed little drawing. As far as that goes, I want you to go ahead and give this a shot and do your best, and get out there. Remember to be more creative, and I wish you all the best. So you guys have yourselves a good day. Bye bye now.